I've been using UniFi devices for more than 3 years now. In these 3 years, UniFi has released a lot more products and have become very popular amongst people that are looking to soup up their home or small business networks. There is, however, one device in their lineup that I don't think gets enough attention on the internet. It's the UniFi switch aggregation. I just recently got one, and in this video we're going to talk about why I think this is one of UniFi's best kept secrets that a lot of people are just overlooking. Hi everyone, welcome to another Tech Talk with Samir, where I talk about anything and everything related to technology in my life. And most of the technology in my life gets connected to the rest of the world through my UniFi home network. I made a video last year talking about my experience with my UniFi home network after 2 years of using it. To summarize, I concluded that I still love my existing setup and there wasn't an immediate need to get things upgraded. I did, however, talk about what I would do differently if I were to build it from scratch with some of UniFi's newer hardware. One device I briefly mentioned in that video was the UniFi switch aggregation. It's an 8-port 10 gigabit switch that only costs $270. Since I made that video, UniFi released a few more 10 gig switches, and I think this one seems to have gotten lost amongst all the hype. When I search YouTube, I barely see any videos talking about this switch. So I thought maybe I was just overvaluing it in my head, so decided to just buy one and try it out. But before I talk about this switch specifically, I want to talk about 10 gig networking in general. The vast majority of devices out there that have Ethernet ports can support at most gigabit speeds. Now the specifics are important here. Note that I said gigabit, not gigabyte. Each byte is 8 bits, so 1 gigabit per second is actually 125 megabytes per second. And the reason why I think it's important to understand what these speeds mean in bytes rather than bits is because, let's face it, we're more familiar with bytes when it comes to the size of our data. So it's a lot easier to visualize the speeds when we translate them to bytes per second instead of bits per second. Sort of like why you don't want to see highway speed limits say kilometers per hour while the distance signs say miles. You get the point. So for most people, gigabit is more than enough for what they do on their network. For internet browsing, video streaming, and basic file transfers between devices, 125 megabytes per second is not going to be limiting at all. So in summary, majority of the people out there doesn't need to look past the gigabit switches that UniFi offers to build out their network. That being said, there is a subset of people out there, including myself, that benefit greatly from having 10 gig network speeds. So let's put things to perspective to illustrate why. If you've already done the complicated math, you know that 10 gigabit is 10 times faster than 1 gigabit. When we translate to bytes, we're talking roughly 1.25 gigabytes per second. That's some major speed. To further put things to perspective, if you had a traditional mechanical hard drive on your computer, on average, you can expect roughly 120 megabytes per second for reading and writing to it. The fastest SATA-based SSDs can go up to around 600 megabytes per second when it comes to read and write. So theoretically, you can transfer data over a 10 gigabit network twice as fast as a SATA-based SSD can even handle. So why would anyone need this? Specifically, why do I need this? Well, my desktop computer has a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD. It's super fast. However, I don't save any of my files on that drive. Its one and only purpose is to hold my operating system and all the software I have installed. When it comes to saving my files, I have a couple of network attached storage devices. So anytime I'm opening or saving a file, I access those devices over the network. And in a lot of cases, I would be completely fine with just gigabit networking. However, my workflow involves a lot of media handling, like importing thousands of raw photos in Lightroom after an event, or editing videos on Premiere with several hundred gigabytes of uncut footage. Having a 10 gigabit network allows me to work straight off my NAS devices without having to copy things locally to get acceptable speeds. So up until now, I've actually been using a MikroTik switch for my 10 gigabit devices. I actually made a video about it on my channel a while ago. It's an affordable 10 gigabit switch with 4 10 gigabit ports. It's been working great and I generally don't have any issues with it. But the thing with UniFi is that once you're sucked into the ecosystem, you look down upon any networking gear that isn't UniFi. Sort of like when an iPhone user receives a text message from an Android user. Those green bubbles, let's admit it, no iPhone user likes them. So I've always had an itch to upgrade my 10 gig switch to something from UniFi. And as I mentioned in my last UniFi video, this USW-Aggregation is the one I had my eyes on. So let's see if it was worth the anticipation. Inside the box, you get the switch itself, along with another small box that contains the power cable and some rack mounting accessories. The power cable is just the standard type that you'd use on a computer. Looking at the switch itself, there's actually not much to it. There's just 8 SFP Plus ports. There is, however, a small LCD on the left side of the device. A lot of UniFi's newer devices have these built-in LCDs to show you things like IP addresses, throughput, and firmware versions. It can be pretty useful if you're trying to troubleshoot something in a large data center with lots of devices, but in a home environment, I likely won't be looking at it too often. One thing that jumps out right away is that there's no RJ45 ports. This switch only has SFP Plus ports, and that's something you need to account for if you're planning on getting this switch. Because even for uplink to the rest of your network, you'll have to connect through one of the SFP Plus ports. So you either need SFP ports on one of your other switches, or you need to get an SFP Plus to RJ45 transceiver. My 24-port Gigabit switch actually has 2 SFP ports, so I can just use a direct attached copper cable to connect it to my network. That brings me to the cabling for your devices. So because this thing only has SFP Plus ports, your regular Ethernet cables running throughout your house can't just be plugged directly into this. To connect regular Ethernet cables with RJ45 jacks to this switch, you need to use some SFP Plus to RJ45 transceivers. That being said, that's the least efficient way to connect your devices to this switch. You see, SFP Plus to RJ45 transceivers use a lot of power. In fact, they get so hot you can't even touch them comfortably after it's been connected for a while. So if you're planning to buy this switch for your home, don't plan on populating all 8 ports with SFP Plus to RJ45 transceivers. It likely won't be able to handle the power draw. From what I've read online, you shouldn't use more than 2 of them to keep it within comfortable operating range. Also, another factor to consider is that most houses are equipped with Cat5e Ethernet cables, which aren't rated for 10 gig speeds anyways. Depending on how far your devices are, you'll need a minimum of Cat6 cabling. So what else can you use? Well, you have 2 other options. If your devices are right next to the switch, like servers or NAS devices, you can use something called a direct attached copper cable. These come in short lengths, but they're quite efficient and affordable. Make sure to get SFP Plus stack cables to ensure it supports 10 gig speeds. And the other option you have is to use fiber optic cabling, especially if you're connecting to devices that are physically far from the switch. This is the most efficient way to connect your switch, but it's also probably the most expensive. You'll need to buy SFP Plus to fiber transceivers along with the cabling itself. Not to mention, fiber cables are a lot more fragile than your typical Ethernet cables, so running them to your devices isn't exactly simple. For me personally, I have 4 devices connecting to the switch. 3 of them are actually located within my network closet, so I'm just using DAC cables for those. The 4th device is my desktop computer, which is located roughly 100 feet away. So for that, I'm using just a Cat6 cable with SFP Plus to RJ45 transceivers. Now I know it's not ideal, and I do plan on later switching to a fiber cable, but for now it should be fine. In fact, I've been using it with my MikroTik switch for almost 2 years now. To do the initial setup, I just hooked up my switch to my 1 gig switch using a DAC cable and went to my UniFi network application. The switch showed up on my device list and gave me an option to adopt it. Once I adopted it, it went through a series of firmware updates and reboots before it showed up as online. After that, I just went ahead and connected all my devices, and the IP addresses just picked right back up automatically, and that's all there was to it. All 4 devices were working just like they were with my MikroTik switch. The adopting process was actually exactly the same as any other UniFi switches, so nothing groundbreaking there to talk about. I will say though that during the setup and firmware updates, the LCD screen was actually very helpful because it showed me the status of what was happening, even though I couldn't see it in the network application. So the anxiety you get during reboots is heavily reduced. In terms of performance, it performs exactly as you'd expect. The file transfer speeds between my computer and my NAS devices are insanely fast compared to a gigabit network. It's not quite the theoretical 1.25 gigabytes per second, but that has to do with the limitations of the drives I'm using in my NAS. The goal of having a 10 gigabit network is to make sure that the network is not a limiting factor. Comparing to the MikroTik switch, the performance is actually very similar. Then again, that switch was a great buy as well, and I still highly recommend it for anyone looking to get into 10 gigabit networking on a budget. But then why did I switch? No pun intended. Well, a couple of reasons. One was that I already used up all the ports on my MikroTik switch, so if I wanted to add a few more 10 gig devices, I was gonna have to buy something else anyways. And the second, and probably the main reason, is that I just wanted all my network devices to be UniFi. Yes, I know it's not a good reason, but like I've said before, UniFi is like a black hole. Once you dip into the ecosystem, you get sucked right in. And my 10 gig switch not being an UniFi one has been an itch that I've been looking to scratch for almost 2 years now. And this one being what it is and only costing $270 is finally what led me to give in. I mean, if you look at UniFi's lineup of 10 gigabit devices, nothing even comes close to the pricing of this one. So if this switch is such a good value, why aren't more people talking about it? I think it's because of a few reasons. One of the reasons is that there just isn't as big of a market for 10 gigabit networking amongst the average crowd. I think 2.5 gigabit networking will probably become much more mainstream in the coming years, and we'll see a lot more attention being put towards those devices before 10 gigabit gets traction. Another reason is the fact that this thing doesn't have any RJ45 ports. The average person doesn't want to deal with fiber or DAC cables. They want to use the cabling that they're most familiar with. So when they see a device with no RJ45 ports, it's possible that they overlook it simply because they're unfamiliar or don't want to deal with the headache. Also, depending on what they have currently, it's possible that the overall cost for them may be higher with this switch when you factor in cabling and transceivers. The switch is just one part of the whole equation. And the third reason why I think this gets overlooked is just how UniFi markets this switch compared to their other ones. Just the way it's named, for example. I mean, if someone was going off the names of their switches, there's nothing in the name USW-Aggregation that says anything about this device. You actually have to read the description to realize that it's just a 10 gigabit switch. I mean, the average consumer probably doesn't even know what the term aggregation means in terms of networking. All their RJ45 based 10 gig devices have the letters XG in the name. So if they were just browsing on the website, sifting through it, it's easy to overlook anything that doesn't have XG if you're looking for a 10 gig switch. I also think the pricing has something to do with it as well. As you look through the 10 gig devices that they offer, the next cheapest device is the Switch Flex XG. So just by default in your mind, if you're sorting by price, you might assume that all their 10 gig offerings will cost a minimum of $300. So you might potentially overlook this $270 option that's right in front of you. So in my opinion, I think UniFi wants the average consumer to look past this one and maybe look into the RJ45 10 gig switches. So when you factor all this in, I think this switch is one of UniFi's best kept secrets, and more people should look into it if they're planning on adding a 10 gig component to their network. I do have a few more upgrades in the works to my UniFi network in the coming weeks, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay tuned for those videos. Let's just say my USG is getting very old and it might be due for an upgrade. Also, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button for the YouTube algorithm. It really helps me grow this small channel. As always, stay safe and I'll see you again on the next one.